I can say that our people, without being stupidly optimistic, are full of confidence and are absolutely resolved.
Let us then move forward together in discharge of our mission and our duty, fearing God and nothing else.
Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful historical morsels of British political history.
Before we kick off this week, I just want to say how pleased we've been with the response to our last episode, looking at Ted Heath's long post-premiership, a time that's often known as the incredible sulk. Such was the response that we've done a special bonus episode in which Richard and I interview Dr. Mark Garnett, an eminent Conservative historian and also a former researcher for Ted Heath. You can find that special bonus episode on the Substack that accompanies the podcast. Visit www.sinceattleeandchurchill.com and you'll be able to find the podcast there. This week, I'm thrilled again by our topic choice. We're discussing somebody who isn't necessarily a household name, and arguably never was unless you lived in New Zealand or Yorkshire in the 1970s. But it's somebody who I think is a fascinating political life, Austin Mitchell. In particular, we'll be looking at why this Oxford-educated, charismatic and telegenic Labour MP never made the front line of British politics. But first, we discuss matters of interest, something which has caught our eyes this week that we think is good enough to share. I'll kick us off. So earlier this week, I was at the Margaret Thatcher conference that was put on by the Centre for Policy Studies at the Guildhall in London. There were some very interesting panels, and generally speaking, I enjoyed the day. And one of the most interesting for me was a discussion between Sir Neil Ferguson, the historian, and George Osborne, who was a long-standing Conservative politician and former Chancellor. There were some things that were said in that which I thought were really interesting and I'd touch upon. One of them is that Ferguson is very pro-Kerry Badenoch. He was maybe the most positive voice of the entire conference about the current Conservative leader, which was interesting because he's a historian, of course, who knows a huge amount about the grand sweep of Western history. And it was interesting to see how enthusiastic he was about Badenoch. Osborne had some very interesting things to say about Conservative strategy, particularly as somebody who, alongside David Cameron, helped drag the party out of the misery of opposition after 2005 and take it back into government, albeit as part of a coalition in 2010. Some of the things that Osborne says I think were particularly interesting. One of them was that we hear a lot about reform and the Conservatives needing a reform strategy, but actually the Conservatives also need a Lib Dem strategy. There are 72 Lib Dem MPs. A very great many of them happen to represent constituencies that were once thought as safe Tory seats, including seats formerly held by David Cameron, Theresa May and Boris Johnson. And if the Conservative Party is to really recover, certainly if it's to get to majority territory once again, it's going to need a way to win those seats back. Another piece of George Osborne advice was that the Conservatives and Kerry Badenoch should worry less about what people think of them today and instead focus on what you want people to think by the next election. His point was that at the point at which everybody goes to vote in 2028 or 2029, everybody in the country is going to know the name of the Conservative Party leader. The question is, what do they know about them and what do they think of them consequently? And it's a very different thing from just trying to get headlines today to try and build a reputation for 2, 3, 4 years' time. And the other key insight that he gave was that whilst there were lots of issues that the Conservative Party may want to fight on day to day, there are some central issues that are going to be key at the next election. And the NHS in particular is something that has often seen the Tories kneecapped in the short campaign by very effective Labour strategies. Listening to that discussion in particular was a reminder that George Osborne, whether you love him or loathe him, and I know he splits a lot of opinions, is about as good a reader as a political picture as anyone, and still had a lot of very valuable insights to offer. So it was a good day. It was a great conference with some really nice and interesting panels there. But yes, that was perhaps my favourite and the one from which I took the most. Richard, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, I should just say first on George Osborne, I'm very much in the loathe him camp, but in spite of myself, I've really enjoyed listening to his Political Currency podcast with Ed Balls, and whatever one might say about George Osborne in terms of his policy choices, I think you can say that he really does understand politics and political strategy and really what one needs to do to win office in today's modern media environment.
Absolutely.
So my matter of interest this week is about the political impact of internal migration. So I'm currently teaching a course at Queen Mary University of London on race and US politics. And one of the most important factors in understanding party politics around race in the United States today is to go back to the early 20th century, where from the 1910s to the 1960s, 6.5 million African Americans left the US South and went to cities in the Northeast, Midwest, and West Coast. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Newark, New York, Boston, Los Angeles, and many more. At the start of the 20th century, most of these cities were 90+% white. By the end of the century, most of them were majority non-white. A city like Detroit, white population was about 10%. So the composition, the demographics of the cities changed really dramatically in the course of the 20th century. Also, very importantly, the African-American population went from being a predominantly rural southern population to a population that was, by the middle of the 20th century, a majority urban and non-southern population. So at the start of the 20th century, about 9 in 10 African Americans lived in the former states of the Confederacy. And by the middle of the 20th century, just half did. And this had profound consequences for American party politics. When they were living in the American South at the start of the 20th century, African Americans had been deprived the ability to vote due to racially oppressive laws and segregation and racial violence. And when they moved to cities in the rest of the country, although they were often met with racial violence and forms of discrimination, they were able to register to vote and to participate in electoral politics. And African American voters made a fateful decision to align themselves eventually with the Democratic Party. This had huge consequences for the policy positions of the Democratic Party, which transformed from a party of white supremacy to a party of civil rights. There is, at the moment in the United States, another internal migration taking place, not quite as dramatic as the Great Migration and for different set of reasons. But we are seeing that states in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West Coast are losing population, whereas southern and western states are gaining population. So since 2020, the state of New York has lost over 330,000 residents. Illinois has lost over 100,000 residents. California has lost 125,000 residents. This is the first time that California's population has declined since it received statehood in 1850. In contrast, southern states like Florida has gained 1.8 million residents. Texas has gained 2.1 million residents, and that's just in the last 4 or 5 years. Also, we've seen states that are in the internal part of the United States, once derided as flyover country, are now experiencing big increases in their population. States like Utah, Idaho, Arizona. Now, the political scientist who wrote about this week on Substack, Nate Moore, argued that this population shift will have profound partisan consequences that will be to the detriment of Democrats, because California, New York, Illinois will lose electoral college votes. They will lose districts in the House of Representatives, and states like Florida and Texas will gain them. And that may be true. But I think thinking of the experience of the Great Migration, we must also think about how the new transplants in these states may change the politics of the states to which they move. We don't quite know how this will all pan out. But it does go back to my matter of interest from last week, where I said that where people decide to live in a country can have huge political and policy consequences, and that we who study politics and history need to take political geography very seriously.
That's fascinating. And of course, we spend a lot of time, certainly in the current debates, not just in the UK or the US, but across a great many countries, thinking about external migration, people who are coming into a country from overseas. But we don't often discuss internal migration. And it would be really fascinating to see how that's played out over the decades as well here in the UK. It'd probably be harder to analyse because we don't, of course, counties are not the equivalent of states and they don't have the same data collection around their populations. But I do wonder if from the census you could map something out about that and see whether or not it really sort of justifies a lot of our thinking about brain drains from regions outside of London and the southeast and into the capital and the surrounding counties. Well, let's turn to our main topic this week, which is Austin Mitchell. And Mitchell was the Member of Parliament for Grimsby from 1977 to 2015, a remarkably long political life. So, Richard, let's start at the beginning. What was his youth like?
Well, I had the honour of being asked to write Austin Mitchell's entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography last year, and it will come out later this year. And so much of what we're discussing today is based on the research that I had done for that entry. I met Austin Mitchell a number of times. I doubt he would have known who I was, but I certainly knew him. And you're absolutely right, Lee, he had a long and fascinating political life, and also a life which spanned continents and a life which had a hinterland, and he had all kinds of different interests as well. But his life begins in 1934 in Belden, near Bradford in Yorkshire. Austin Mitchell's father worked for the Bradford Dyers Association, and his mother had a part-time job working in Bradford Market. Mitchell described his upbringing as sort of lower middle class. They lived in a new interwar housing estate. Mitchell, in his kind of typically sarcastic style, described his community as, quote, conservative, which is why they voted solidly Labour. With the exception of an annual family trip to Morecambe, which in those days was sometimes known as Bradford by the Sea, Mitchell did not step foot outside of Yorkshire until he was a teenager. He was fiercely proud of his Yorkshire roots and once again jokingly argued that it would be better for the Labour Party to deploy all Yorkshire shortlists than all women shortlists in the selection of MPs. Mitchell was a grammar school boy. He won a place at Bingley Grammar School. And then from there, in 1952, he won a scholarship to study at Manchester University. He was admitted to Manchester to read French, but he quickly switched to history, and he obtained a bachelor's and a master's at Manchester. And it was in Manchester that he joined the Labour Party. He joined following a march to protest against the Conservative government's machinations in Suez. And he remained a party member for the rest of his really quite long life. Shortly afterwards, from Manchester, he won a place at Nuffield College, Oxford, which was my college and one of the locations where I bumped into Austin Mitchell at an alumni event. And he wrote his DPhil there on the Whigs in opposition, 1815 to 1830.
So he's essentially part of that great meritocratic generation born before the Second World War. The people who often went to and benefited hugely from grammar schools, became the first in their families to go to university, and in his case, eventually a DPhil, a doctorate from Oxford. And it was during his studies in Oxford, I understand, that he got an offer that transformed his life in many respects. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so Austin Mitchell was coming to the end of his doctorate in 1959, And it just so happened that there was a professor visiting Oxford from the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand, which we visited the other year,
Yeah.
you and I, Lee. And the visiting professor was looking for someone from Oxford to come and teach at Otago. And so Mitchell sat with him. They had a fairly, I think, informal kind of interview. Mitchell was hired on the spot. That's sort of how academic appointments happened back in those days. No longer, I think. Well, I know. And Austin Mitchell agreed to move to the other side of the world, to Dunedin. And he spent the next 8 years on the South Island of New Zealand, the first 4 at Otago. And then he was appointed to a senior lectureship in politics at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch. And it was his sympathetic book on New Zealand society and politics, the half-gallon, quarter-acre Pavlova Paradise, that became a kind of domestic classic. Mitchell really fell in love with New Zealand. He described it in one of his books as, quote, the best place on earth outside of Grimsby. And he later regretted that he ever left. Now, this is really crucial from his New Zealand experience. Mitchell was a pioneer in the early days of New Zealand television. New Zealand was much later than Britain or America in actually setting up broadcast television. And so he was one of the first television personalities in New Zealand because Austin Mitchell hosted a weekly political discussion program. And he had a remarkably wide range of guests. He interviewed the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Keith Holyoake. He also interviewed Miss New Zealand in a bikini. And because New Zealand only at that time had one channel, if you were hosting a program on New Zealand television, then everyone in the country watched your program. And he was New Zealand's first teledon. It was also at the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation that he met his wife, Linda McDougall, who herself has had a very distinguished career as a documentary filmmaker, writer, and biographer, including having published quite recently a biography of Harold Wilson's political secretary, Marcia Williams, a person on whom I hope we do another podcast episode.
We've discussed New Zealand before, and it's quite interesting to think about what his life may have been like if he had stayed. I think New Zealand politics is often seen as quite amateur by comparison to larger countries. I hope Kiwis won't be offended by me saying that. And by the time he was a nationally prominent figure, like you say, on the one TV channel at the time, I half wonder if he had stayed, how far he could have risen on the other side of the world. But we can only speculate, as what happens then is he spends these 8 years in Dunedin and Christchurch and then comes back.
Yes, he could have done a sort of reverse Brian Gould. Brian Gould was a UK Labour politician, a near contemporary in terms of age with Austin Mitchell, who was born and raised in New Zealand and then came to Oxford and then made a career in the British Labour Party over here in the UK. But you're right, Lee, after 8 years, Austin Mitchell returns to Britain, and that's something that he says he later regrets. He had been offered a professorship at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch in 1967, but he turned it down because he'd been given an offer to become a fellow in politics at Nuffield College, to return to Oxford, to return to Nuffield. So he did, and in terms of academic esteem, that was clearly the move that you would make in career terms, but he really didn't like being back in Oxford. He was now one of many fishes in a big pond, I suppose, rather than a big fish in a small pond. And he also missed his broadcasting experience. He really had enjoyed being on television every week in New Zealand. But as luck would have it, one of his Nuffield colleagues, David Butler, invited a group of television executives to dinner at Nuffield. And one of the executives there was from Yorkshire Television. He happened to sit next to Austin Mitchell at dinner. They hit it off, and this eventually translated into a job offer to Mitchell to work full-time at Yorkshire TV. So he decided to leave his fellowship at Nuffield, which would have been something he could have held for his entire life, and to embark on this fairly new, up-and-coming broadcaster, Yorkshire TV. It was quite a ramshackle operation, but I think that suited Austin Mitchell. He co-hosted the flagship program Calendar, which had lots of teething issues with it. The lights wouldn't switch on at the right time, or there would be odd gaps in the editing of the program. And Mitchell started to call it Colander, the program with holes in it. But this format allowed Mitchell to be freewheeling and experimental. For example, he found a direct descendant of Guy Fawkes, and on bonfire night got him to agree to sit on top of a massive bonfire, which then Austin Mitchell doused in petrol and set alight. And then this man had to escape from the inferno. And this was all filmed for Yorkshire television. And it was very entertaining, I suppose, for the people watching it.
Okay, so let's fast forward to 1977. And by this stage, I think you get the feeling that there's a lot of pent-up potential in Mitchell's career. He's clearly academically gifted. He's doing these quite eccentric, but presumably quite entertaining things on television and getting an audience for it. And Tony Crosland, the Foreign Secretary, has died. There's a by-election in his seat. Labour's majority in the Commons is on an absolute knife edge. And so at this really high-stakes moment for the government, for Labour, they turn to Mitchell to be the party's candidate for Grimsby. So why did Labour choose him? And then how did that campaign unfold?
Mitchell had already started to dip his toes into the water of Labour parliamentary selections, but I don't think he took it all that seriously. He was so focused on his Yorkshire TV job. But when Crosland died unexpectedly of a stroke in February 1977, the Labour Party was casting around for a kind of star candidate, someone who could really attract a lot of positive publicity in what was likely to be a very tough and difficult campaign in a seat that Labour could lose and which could in turn endanger the very survival of the Labour government. Mitchell was a very, very entertaining, sharp and charismatic campaigner. He was also a staunch Eurosceptic and an opponent of the common fisheries policy, which was something that his voters in Grimsby agreed with him quite strongly on. But it should be said that although Austin Mitchell would have been a somewhat familiar figure, Grimsby is not in Yorkshire. And so when Mitchell arrived in Grimsby to campaign, he says there was graffiti on the walls of the streets saying, "Yorkies go home," or even "Death to Yorkies." And Mitchell actually thought that he'd lost the election. It was a tough campaign, and he began to concede losing the seat on live television on polling night, only for his wife Linda to interrupt him and say, "You've won it, you fool." And he had. He won the seat by 520 votes.
It is just worth reflecting on what an achievement it was to hold the seat, in fact, given Labour's unpopularity at the time. I mean, by-elections had basically meant disaster for the Labour Party in recent years. In the 4 Labour defences that they tried to hold before the Grimsby by-election, there was a by-election in Walsall North, it fell to the Conservatives. A by-election in Workington, it fell to the Conservatives. A by-election in Birmingham Stetchford, it fell to the Conservatives. That was Roy Jenkins' old seat when he was appointed President of the European Commission, and also a by-election in Ashfield, which also fell to the Conservatives. So you can really sense how there would have been an expectation here that Labour would have lost. And by holding it, even by holding it by just 520 votes, Mitchell really helped to do the Labour Party and the Labour government a huge favour. So he's in the Commons and presumably gets a tremendous response from Labour MPs having won the seat. Does his career then start to take off?
Yes, well, initially he's seen as someone who, as you say, pulled off a great electoral upset. He is also recognised as someone who understands television and media very well. And also he's regarded as someone who's very clever. He was quite soon appointed as a parliamentary private secretary to Roy Hattersley, who was the Minister of State for Prices and Consumer Protection at that time. And that is the sort of the lowest ranks of the ministerial ladder, that you start as a PPS and work your way up. But as it happened, that post was also the highest rank that Austin Mitchell ever achieved in government. 2 years after he's elected, Labour loses the 1979 election, and Mitchell spends the next 18 years as an opposition MP. Now, in opposition, Mitchell holds some frontbench roles. He was initially appointed as an opposition whip. He was sacked from that position in 1982 after he broke the Labour whip on the renewal of Northern Ireland Protection of Terrorism Act. However, Mitchell then claimed that he'd mistakenly voted against the whip and that he'd wandered into the wrong lobby accidentally. So eventually the whips bought that, whether that was true or not, and they restored him to his position a month later. But after Labour's defeat in 1983, Mitchell decided that he would go on to the committee track in Parliament, which is sort of the parallel that many MPs explore if they're not that interested or unable to take a frontbench role. And I think Mitchell quite liked the committee system. It suited his inquisitorial instincts, the kind of interviewing style that he had pioneered in television. He could now apply as an MP in committee hearings and investigations. When Labour came back into government in 1997, Austin Mitchell was not offered any position. Part of this we can attribute to bad timing. He was 42 when he was elected. He was 44 when Labour lost office in 1979. And he was 62 when Labour returned to power. And so he wasn't seen as an up-and-coming, young, dynamic MP by that time. He was regarded by many of the Labour MPs in the 1990s as a sort of part of the old guard, part of the old Labour generation, even though he'd actually only been in Parliament for 2 years during those previous Labour governments.
This, for me, is fascinating. You've got a low middle class, well-educated, telegenic, charismatic, and intelligent politician, but he can't get up the greasy pole. He's stuck, in effect, on the lowest rungs and then on the backbenches. At its most boring and obvious, I guess, the explanation comes from the bad timing and the bad luck, that he just happened to get into Parliament at the wrong time, just before 18 years of Conservative government. But that doesn't really explain why he doesn't get promoted in opposition. So why do you think that is? What was it about Austin Mitchell that meant that Michael Foot and then Neil Kinnock and then John Smith and then Tony Blair didn't want him around?
Well, he partly didn't like opposition. He found it really quite boring. He didn't like the posturing. But I think a bigger issue is that Mitchell found collective responsibility rather difficult. He used to criticize Neil Kinnock, which isn't really something a shadow minister should do. And he just really couldn't resist a quip, even if it got him further in trouble.
So there's a sense of him being quite a flippant person. So I'm almost left to wonder, was he just not serious enough? It seems almost silly to say, in a sense, due to his obvious intellectual heft. But could he just almost not resist a joke?
There was definitely a problem of self-restraint that Mitchell had. But I think there is a more serious side to this as well, that Mitchell increasingly became a vocal critic of the change in policy direction within the Labour Party. He accused John Smith, who was elected Labour leader in 1992, of taking Labour in a rightward economic direction. He said that Smith had watered down Labour's policy offer to nothing much at all. So I suppose as Labour approached government in the 1990s, rather than say the kind of things that would endear him with the party leadership, Mitchell became more and more critical. And so that, I think, also explains why they didn't want to put him in a shadow or government role.
We've spoken before about the value of a good backbencher and how it's actually a very useful and worthwhile role to have in the House of Commons if you know what you want to do with it and you're sort of committed to trying to get something done from a non-front bench position. How do you think Mitchell fits into that pattern? Was he good at being a backbencher, given that it seemed to be the position he was destined to occupy? And when he's on the backbenches for all those years, how does he make a mark in politics?
As a backbencher, he was unusually successful, especially as an opposition backbencher. Between 1979 and 1997, he sponsored more successful legislation than any opposition MP. So he basically took up a few causes and became their champion in Parliament, and any opportunity he had to raise them with the government, he would try. And he looked at areas of policy that might not necessarily be obviously partisan, but would make a difference and change in British politics. So, for example, perhaps unsurprisingly, given his broadcasting experience, he was a great supporter of bringing television cameras into the House of Commons, which eventually happened in 1989. He was also a leading advocate for making the wearing of seatbelts compulsory. Now, Barbara Castle, as Transport Minister, had made it compulsory for new cars to be built with seatbelts in them, but it wasn't actually until the Thatcher government that it was compulsory to actually put the seatbelt on when the car was in motion. And Mitchell had been a great advocate of this because he himself had nearly died in a car accident near Bedford and became a great advocate for automobile safety. So these were all kind of bitty things that he did as a backbencher, but, they were substantive and made a material difference. I'd also say that Mitchell was a prolific author and writer, and he wrote many books on a wide variety of topics. He continued to write about New Zealand, but he also wrote about British politics. He wrote about Labour Party history. He published books about photography, which was one of his great passions. He wrote a wonderful book on the hereditary peers in the House of Lords called Farewell, My Lords. It's a great treasure, actually, which I came by accident a few years ago. But Mitchell went around the House of Lords interviewing all of the hereditary peers before they were kicked out in 1999. It's a great historical record of that last generation as well. So he was certainly someone who didn't just retreat into obscurity as a backbencher. He was an active backbencher, perhaps a hyperactive backbencher politician. So I think that we can say that he was successful in his backbench role.
For all these years, he was MP for Grimsby, and you can't know anything about Grimsby really without knowing about its role in the fishing industry. Now, fish is a big, big deal in that part of Lincolnshire. How did that influence him and his politics?
Yes, Grimsby had been for a long time a major long-distance fishing port. Grimsby was really quite badly affected by Britain joining the European Economic Community in 1973, because as part of that, Ted Heath irresponsibly allowed for a free-for-all in the waters that British fishermen had once fished in, and this led to a depletion of the kind of stock that the fishermen from Grimsby could gain access to. And Mitchell, throughout his parliamentary career, was a great champion for the declining fishing industry and for fishermen. For years and years, he fought for better pension compensation for that last generation of long-distance fishermen from Grimsby. And even after Grimsby stopped sending fishermen out to the North Sea to catch fish, then Mitchell fought for the production of and processing of fish in Grimsby, including the making of fish fingers. He founded the group Save Britain's Fish, and he would regularly pull stunts to sort of promote the buying of British fish. He showed up outside the Houses of Parliament dressed in a yellow raincoat, offering passers-by a taste of what he claimed was the world's longest fish finger. And in something that lots of people talk about with Austin Mitchell, he is said to have changed his name by deed poll to Haddock in 2002 to promote the industry. And I looked into this when I wrote his DMB entry, because deed poll name changes are matters of public record. So you can look this up. And I couldn't find the record for Austin or Haddock Mitchell. And as it turns out, it's quite likely that Austin Mitchell actually didn't change his name by deed poll, that it was a publicity stunt by one of the fish finger companies. But all of his obituaries claim that he did this. And even Keir Starmer, in his statement when Austin Mitchell died, claimed that he loved Grimsby so much that he had changed his name to Haddock. But I think that is something of a fishtail that Austin Mitchell did very little to disabuse people of.
You can see in this rich character sort of that he brought to politics something of the Boris Johnson almost. I can kind of imagine Johnson in a big yellow fisherman's coat, handing out part of what he claimed was the biggest fish finger in the world and saying, if the fishing industry doesn't get better after Brexit, then I'll change my name to Haddock or something like that. There's this sort of eccentricity to him as a figure, which is quite rare in politics. Some people would say it's quite trivial and quite daft, but it's quite engaging as well.
Well, Mitchell described himself as a populist socialist.
Right.
So these kind of stunts, which maybe a lot of commentators today would dismiss as populist type stunts, he believed was really an important way of him engaging with the public and bringing attention to a wide range of issues that he cared about. And he thought it was very legitimate and, in fact, quite important for the perspective of a member of parliament who doesn't have, as an individual, that many powers to use the kind of bully pulpit of your position as an MP to try to bring change to policy issues through publicity and stunts, basically.
There's plenty of logic in that, for sure. You've written in your Dictionary of National Biography piece about Mitchell, about how he starts almost on the centre-right of the Labour Party. He calls himself a Gaitskellite, after Hugh Gaitskell, the post-war Labour Chancellor and leader. But then into the late 1980s and certainly the 1990s, he found himself, or certainly very much thought of himself, as being on the Labour left. And Mitchell's claim is effectively that he never changed, but the party moved around him. And where his ideological positioning had once been sort of on the centre-right of the party, he instead almost ended up looking like he was on the far left. I wonder to what extent you think Mitchell's line on that is credible. There were lots of other Gaitskellites, people like Roy Jenkins I'm thinking of in particular, who seemed very much at ease and actually quite supportive of Tony Blair's policies. So do you think it's right that Mitchell sort of was a fork in the ground that never moved, but the world transitioned around him? Or did his politics, in fact, shift over this time?
I think it is a credible analysis from Mitchell, because Mitchell's politics, his socialist politics, were rooted in an economic analysis. And that, I think, is where you see the most profound change in the Labour Party over those years. When he becomes an MP in the 1970s, he calls himself the last surviving Gaitskellite. So he's still seen on the right of the party. And in the 1980s, he does organise against Tony Benn and supports something called the Labour Solidarity Campaign, which was an effort of the kind of soft left and the right of the party to stop Tony Benn from becoming deputy leader and then later leader of the party. But by the 1990s, Mitchell is really no longer seen as a figure of the right of the party. He was very critical of John Smith and Tony Blair. He allies himself with Brian Gould. They create a group called the Labour Campaign for Full Employment. And basically their argument is that the Labour Party, in watering down its economic programme, in embracing the EU, are abandoning the key tenets of a Keynesian economic approach and abandoning Labour's historic policy goal of full employment. Austin Mitchell claims that his Bible was the book by his predecessor in Grimsby, Tony Crosland, The Future of Socialism, which was written in 1956. Basically, it was a book that argued for the basics of Keynesian growth, equality, and state intervention in the economy. Yet in spite of that, or because of those beliefs, by the 2000s, Mitchell is regarded as a kind of dangerous lefty. But I actually don't think you can look at what Mitchell was saying in the 2000s or 2010s in terms of his economic positions and go back and look at what he was saying in the 50s and 60s and see that he had changed very much. But what had changed was the Labour Party's economic programme in profound ways.
Mitchell eventually leaves Parliament in 2015. And shortly afterwards, we have a referendum, of course, on our membership of the European Union, an issue that Mitchell cared about, and where some of the issues that really matter to him, we've spoken about fishing and access to territorial waters, would play a really important and symbolic part. This coda to his career also arguably shows how far outside of the Labour mainstream he's become, as he's a leaver, right, in that referendum. He's also quite an old man, I guess, by the time this happens. So what role did he play in that Brexit referendum campaign in 2016? And what did he say about the issue itself at the time?
He was, by this point, in his 80s. This was kind of his last great campaign. He, for years beforehand, had kind of been campaigning to leave the EU. And when I first started going to Labour Party conferences, 15 years ago, Austin would always speak at the Labour Euro Safeguards Committee fringe. And his speeches were brilliant. They were so funny, so direct, and I think so incisive and insightful. And it was one of my great highlights of going to Labour Party conference was to go to the Euro Safeguards events. And I particularly looked forward to hearing Austin Mitchell's speeches. In the referendum, he gave speeches across the country for the group Labour Leave, which is basically what the Labour Euro Safeguards campaign became. And he really was thrilled with the result. He wrote that it was, quote, a peasant's revolt against the neoliberal policies followed by both parties over the decades. And I think, he saw Brexit as an opportunity for Labour to re-engage with its historic working class base, and also for Labour to rediscover its belief in using the tools of the state, nationalisation, state aid, even looking at things like tariffs and trade, as ways of shaping the economy to benefit the British working class.
And finally, I wonder if we could turn to his legacy. You've mentioned that he came to think of his own career in politics as a failure. Do you think he was unfair to himself, sort of on the whole, in the way in which he rated his own contribution to politics? And did anybody else happen to recognise his achievements?
I do think it is a shame that Mitchell never was able to climb the ministerial ranks. And, perhaps if in the late 60s, rather than get the tap on the shoulder to go work for Yorkshire Television at that dinner at Nuffield, if a Labour Party agent had said, we've got a safe seat for you, could you stand in the 1970 election? Could he have been a minister in the late 1970s? Could he have perhaps even been a cabinet minister in the late 1970s at that time when you had a really remarkable set of big beasts in the Labour government? Dennis Healey, Jim Callaghan, Harold Wilson, Barbara Castle, Tony Benn, Tony Crosland, Shirley Williams, etc., etc. And perhaps Mitchell could have been part of that generation, but his timing was, I think, off. And he just couldn't square the rightward economic direction of the Labour Party in those later years. So that deprived him of that accolade. Nonetheless, I do think that even though Mitchell would say things that could rile people up. He wasn't politically correct. He could say things that sometimes did come off as a bit rude or offensive. He was respected across the House. So, for example, when he died, Tony Blair, they were not great friends, did concede that Austin Mitchell's jovial manner concealed an acute mind. His co-editor of the House magazine, Lord Cormac, described Mitchell as so over the top, but under the froth and banter, he was an intensely serious and able politician. And Mitchell had fans outside of the UK because of these other connections, particularly with New Zealand. And I think it's quite notable that in 2015, when he had his retirement soiree in Grimsby, a former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, actually attended the soiree and even sang a Maori song, Pokarikare Ana, which reduced Austin Mitchell to tears. And that same year, he was awarded by the government of Iceland the Order of the Falcon, a very high honor for foreigners in Iceland, for his work in promoting British-Icelandic relations after the Cod War.
But was there no British honour given to him?
No, and I think he felt quite bitter about how the Labour Party, and particularly the newer generation of Labour MPs, treated him. In 2013, he actually collapsed in the House of Parliament on the way to a vote. He banged his head and he had to get 2 open heart surgeries and a defibrillator. Now, I don't know if this is true, but Austin Mitchell claimed that some of his colleagues literally walked past him as he had collapsed on the floor outside the House of Commons. And I think he just saw that some Labour MPs treated him very badly. I should say that although he had a lot of health difficulties later in life, these did not dim his wit or intelligence. He became an active user of Twitter. And after one of his operations, as he came round, a nurse asked if he could recall his name to make sure that he was still with it. And without missing a beat, Austin Mitchell replied to the nurse, "Yes, my name is David Cameron."
Well, Richard, thank you for sharing those reflections on what I think is a really fascinating political life. We finish each episode with a discussion of the books that we're reading at the moment. So I'll start us off. I recently picked up in Daunt Books a very small book called Could It Happen Here by Peter Hennessy and Andrew Blick. It's part of the House Curiosities series. So the selection of very short read books that only run to about 80 pages. Something I wanted to say at the outset. So Peter Hennessy is rather a hero of mine. I think he's got a remarkable combination of knowledge and intellect, as well as a certain modesty and charm that make him one of the most interesting and most likable writers on British politics in recent decades. I also think he's a very good writer. The book is basically a look at what happens if the good chap's theory of government, something widely associated with Hennessy's work, collapses. The premise is that we have a hard-right government in the UK in power, that it loses a confidence vote, but the Prime Minister refuses to resign. And the question they ask is, how would the system cope? I do think it's a genuinely interesting question. I start from the view, as I personally think is a constitutionally correct one, that if a Prime Minister lost a confidence vote, but refused to either resign or request a dissolution of Parliament, the King would be entitled to dismiss them and invite somebody else to form a government who could command confidence, or if no such person was in evidence, someone who could take on the commission as Prime Minister and then call an election themselves. There's some comparisons here with Australia in 1975 and Gough Whitlam's dismissal. The authors rather disagree with that view. They think the King no longer has the power to dismiss a Prime Minister, something I happen to think is just very, very much untrue. The fact that a power hasn't been used in a long time certainly doesn't mean that it no longer exists. But there are questions about whether or not a monarch would want to do that and how a Prime Minister who was refusing to resign would respond to it. And the sections of the book about who would have responsibilities in that situation, from the Speaker of the House of Commons to the head of the intelligence services, to the Cabinet Secretary, to the King's private secretary, are interesting. And I learned really quite a lot from those sections of the book. In some ways, the title of it feels misguided. They say, could it happen here? Well, of course it could. But the more interesting question is the system robust enough to handle it? My personal view is that it probably is. And I think putting things on a firmer footing, as they rather suggest in the book, with constitutional conventions on the statute books and so on, is a very risky thing to do. Right now, on the other side of the Atlantic, we have a country with all sorts of legal checks on political power, but they don't seem to stop President Trump from flouting norms. Because if he can legally do it, he's seen as having the right to do it. Whereas here, where the rules and conventions are somewhat murkier, the question of is something the right thing to do matters sometimes more than is it a legally possible thing to do. That may have its disadvantages, I don't deny. But on the grand matters of the Constitution, I think this constitutional model that you can muddle through that we have brings many advantages and would see us through the sort of chaotic situation that the book describes. Anyway, it's an interesting book. It's £7.99 and less than 100 pages, so it won't set you back much in terms of cash or time. And if you're interested in these issues, I think it's worth reading. And I think it is the sort of question that can trigger some really interesting debates. So, Richard, what's your book this week?
Just on the point you made about how having a kind of legalistic approach to the Constitution actually empowers people to abuse the Constitution more than having this kind of political constitutional idea. I really agree with that. And I think that speaks to the book, actually, that I've chosen to discuss this week. I'm currently teaching a master's course on US public policy at Queen Mary. And this week we're reading a book called Trump, the Administrative Presidency and Federalism by Frank Thompson, Kenneth Wong, and Barry Ray. Now, it's an academic book. It's published by the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., so it's not necessarily a kind of beach read. But for those who are interested in the fine-grained detail of how policy is actually made and actually implemented through a real-life case of the first Trump presidency, I think it's really a rather interesting and informative read. Now, one of the things that this book shows is both the power and the limits on the power of an American president. So let me just give an example from the book. In November 2016, just after Trump won the presidency, but obviously he hadn't become president yet, in the lame duck period, President Barack Obama's Secretary of the Interior, Sally Jewell, issued a department rule which required companies that drilled for oil and natural gas on federal lands, which are very extensive in some parts of the country, to pay a royalty levy towards a trust that would then be used to fund wildlife and land conservation. Now, in the United States, these kind of agency rules, as they're called, are stickier than normal presidential executive orders. These are not issued directly by the president. They are drawn up by civil servants and then become rules that companies, the government, individuals have to follow. And they are protected from simple repeal by the Administrative Procedures Act. So presidents can come in and they can see new rules drawn up and introduced, but there's a complex process for doing this, and presidents can't simply repeal a rule that exists. But Trump had come in and he wanted to repeal this royalty levy for the Conservation Trust. Now, there is an act of Congress called the Congressional Review Act, which in the first few months of a rule allows Congress to pass a resolution that can stop it from going into effect. So Trump tried to get rid of it that way, but he was thwarted by his own Republican senators, including John McCain, who refused to overturn this rule. Then Trump tried to basically stop the rule from going into effect by delaying its implementation, basically saying, okay, the rule exists, but I'm not going to put it into effect. But he was then sued over that, and a court forced him to put the rule into effect. And then eventually, 20 months into his administration, he was able to get the Land Management Bureau within the Department of Interior to revise or update the rule in such a way that basically would have made this royalty levy meaningless. And even then, he was taken to court, and a judge ruled that he couldn't do that under the Administrative Procedures Act, that the royalty levy had to remain in place. Now, for people who don't like Trump and for people who support the royalty levy policy, and I happen to think it's quite a good idea, we might cheer this. But actually, I don't think it's a very good thing for democratic politics, because why should the decisions of unelected bureaucrats prevail over the policies favored by elected politicians? Trump was legitimately elected in 2016. His policy program clearly included pledges to roll back environmental regulation. And then basically he couldn't actually deliver on the promises that he'd made to his voters. So I just encourage listeners to think, well, what if the shoe was on the other foot and the Administrative Procedures Act and the federal judiciary prevented a president who had pledged to protect the environment from implementing legitimate policies that could protect the environment simply because a group of civil servants said they couldn't. I think that would be a real problem for democratic politics. And I say, let's trust the people on these matters.
We'll have links to the books that we've chosen in our show notes, but that's all from us this week. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week with another deep dive into a topic or a person in British post-war political history. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.